In the middle of the last century, Lithuanian-born Hebrew poet, the great Leah Goldberg, wrote the following poem. Zo sha'at tmura, ba na'amod lemim al gvul ha'or, la'an yifne libenu, ha'im nachzor achi, hana'avor, achi, ech na'amod lemim al gvul ha'or, e derech lefanenu, ha'im nachzor achi, hana'avor. This is an hour of change, she wrote. Within it, we stand uncertain on the border of light. Shall we draw back or cross over? Where shall our hearts turn? Shall we draw back, my brother, my sister, or cross over? This is the hour of change, and within it, we stand quietly on the border of light. What lies before us? Shall we draw back, my brother, my sister, or cross over? These words have been placed in our Shabbat evening prayer books as a suggested meditation for the prayer Ma'ariv Aravim, the blessing for the arrival of evening. Jewish tradition instructs that we read this prayer at night as gratitude for being able to stand on the border between light and dark. We find it sacred to be in that in-between place when the world is changing right before our eyes. Goldberg calls such a place Gvul Ha'or, the border of light, and identifies encountering it as an hour of change. But she writes about it as a place not just where something happens to us, like the setting of the sun or the darkening of the sky, but as a place where we are invited to make a choice. She asks, shall we draw back or cross over? Shall we remain in what we know, or shall we take a step into the mystery of what may come to be? A Hasidic teaching further highlights Judaism's reverence for these hours of change and in-between places. This time, in regards to the transition from night to morning, the first words to escape our lips in the morning, our tradition teaches, are the words, Modeh ani lefanecha. I am grateful to you, O God, for returning my soul to me. Your faith in me is great indeed. And we are to say these words while we're still in bed, even before we have fully awakened. The reason offered by the Hasidim is that when we are not yet fully awake, our bodies and our minds are deeply connected not only to our conscious needs, but our deepest yearnings that may only emerge in our dreams. By saying our morning prayer in that moment, we can be most honest with ourselves and with God about our prayers for the coming day. That is the freedom, the border, an in-between place can provide. Yom Kippur itself is such an in-between place, on the border of who we were and who we might become. And we too have a choice. On this Kol Nidre, Leah Goldberg's question speaks to the urgency of our task. Shall we draw back, my brother, my sister, or shall we cross over? We might draw back because what is on this side is the world we know, a place we've seen, an existence we understand and can predict, and what is on the other side is uncharted territory. But we might cross over for exactly the same reason, and the choice is in our hands. For what is a border in time, or a border anywhere? A place that identifies difference, transition, a boundary where we encounter something new. How we respond to the borders in our lives, to our brushes with the unlived, the yet unknown, the unscripted. How we respond to that kind of place is the essential question of Yom Kippur, and our response to that question will dictate our future. And not just our future, but the future of our community, the future of our country, the future of humanity. Shall we draw back into the past, to the ways we have been, the people we have known, the situations we have scripted, or shall we cross over into what lies before us in this hour of change? Shall we draw back into the ways we have been, or shall we cross over? This is the question that will determine our religious response to this pandemic. Disease has no meaning. It simply is. God did not send this pandemic to test us the way the Torah says God tested Abraham on Mount Moriah. But that does not mean we should not learn from this experience. On the contrary, it is a moral response to such a catastrophe to glean lessons from it about how to find better ways of being. You may recall that at the beginning of the pandemic, a beautiful video was released by UK poet Thomas Roberts, now watched by over 60 million people worldwide, a rendering of a poem he had written entitled The Great Realization. Here is an excerpt, a few words of it, in which he begins by describing the world as it was before COVID-19 and ends with his vision for what we might have learned. He writes, "Every day the skies grew thicker till you couldn't see the stars. So we flew in planes to find them, while down below we filled our cars. We drove all around all day in circles. We'd forgotten how to run. We swapped the grass for tarmac, shrunk the parks till there were none. We filled the sea with plastic because our waste was never capped, until each day when you went fishing, you'd pull them out, already wrapped. But then in 2020, a new virus came our way. The governments reacted and told us all to hide away. But while we were all hidden amidst the fear and all the while, the people dusted off their instincts. They remembered how to smile. And with the skies less full of voyagers, the earth began to breathe, and the beaches bore new wildlife that scuttled off into the seas. Some people started dancing, some were singing, some were baking. We'd grown so used to bad news, but some good news was in the making. So when we found the cure and were allowed to go outside, we all preferred the world we'd found to the one we'd left behind. Old habits became extinct, and they made way for the new, and every simple act of kindness was now given its due. We call it, he concludes, the Great Realization, and yes, since then there have been many, but that's the story of how it started and why hindsight's 2020. What will it mean to have gone through this pandemic with all its challenges, to have lost so many lives and disrupted so many more, and to draw back to the ways we once were, to have no great realization that propels us into a new way of being? That is what our spiritual seeking is for, to engage with that question. We all know what we've missed. The parties and the festivals, the hugs freely given, the ways our children used to play, their smiles sparkling, carefree in the sun, a full sanctuary. But the consumptive, callous, exploitative existence we had before, that is the world of the known. And it is the world that allowed this pandemic to take such a devastating toll. In that world, the workers we now call essential are often underpaid and objectified as a matter of course. In that world, overcrowding of classrooms and relying on schools to feed hungry children is just an inconvenient fact of life. In that world, we travel constantly, consume with impunity, holding no regard for sustainability or the preservation of energy, and we do not hold to account those who have the power to change how we consume. But here we are now, at the border, in an hour of change. So shall we draw back my brother, my sister? Or shall we cross over? The choice is in our hands. Shall we draw back to the people we have known, or shall we cross over? This is the question that will determine whether we preserve democracy or lose it. The ways we have entrenched ourselves among the people we have known all but ensures that we will lose all ability to communicate across lines of difference, to tell the stories that bring us together and humanize us. Though we have access to more information about more people's lives than ever, we are less empathetic and more polarized than ever. Segregation by race is still a fact of life for most of us, kept intact by the structural racism that is baked into many of our institutions. And our animosity toward those who hold divergent views is deep and seething. Because of the way we can choose to consume our news, often we don't even have a meeting of the minds regarding what is fact, what is true, what is real. Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, who lived in the first half of the 20th century, taught that revelation exists in the encounter between two human beings, that God speaks to us from the space between people when real, authentic connections are formed across a border. I thou, as Buber called it, is a kind of relationship within which pure, even divine learning can take place. That is what our work, for example, with Together New Orleans and Building Friendships, Building Power here at Touro is all about, finding that place of connection and thereby revelation. The place we are right now, without our intentional effort, is not a place where this kind of revelation is apt to occur. More likely, we demonize people with whom we disagree politically so that we leave no room for growth between us. No revelation can emerge from this. But here we are now, at the border, in an hour of change. So shall we draw back, my brother, my sister, or shall we cross over? The choice is in our hands. Shall we draw back to the situations we have scripted, or shall we cross over? This is the question that will determine whether there is a future for humanity at all. When the Israelites stood on the shores of the Red Sea, they hesitated, as you'll recall. They were terribly afraid because before them was a terrain full of challenges they could not possibly anticipate. The mud pits of Egypt were at least known, all entrances and exits and lines written in that play. So at the shore of the sea, they paused, they prayed, they raged against Moses for leading them to the border of the known. But ultimately, they had to wade into the water. There was no other option if they were to have a chance of surviving. There are currently 70 million people around the world who have been forcibly displaced by conflict and persecution, human rights abuses, natural disasters, and this number continues to grow quickly as the planet's temperature rises and climate change continues to take hold. A major report recently issued by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change describes a future in which climate change is the most severe existential health crisis on the planet. Heat waves, fires, floods, famines, these will drive people from their homes into the arms of the unknown. We are going to need each other like never before, and the situations in which we will find ourselves will be inevitably unscripted, unfamiliar, just as so many of us relied on the spontaneous support of family and friends to weather Hurricane Ida. Our congregation is beginning to place ourselves in unscripted situations, interacting with those seeking asylum here and learning and sharing with them through our work with Home is Here, NOLA, and our project Re'acha. New situations in which we are thrown together taking care of each other, being taken care of, interacting with strangers who need or can give that support, these will be disconcerting and bewildering instances. And yet, the world we are in, as it is, like the Israelites on the shores of the sea, it is finite and it is suffocating. So here we are, at the border, in an hour of change. Shall we draw back, my brothers, my sister? Or shall we cross over? The choice is in our hands. Professor and writer Luis Alberto Urrea speaks of borders in this way. Quote, that place of crossing, that place of pressure, of two things meeting. That's where the plankton wells up, he writes, and the currents meet. And you can choose to see it in different ways. Either the border is a hideous, festering scar of oppression, horror, and violence, or it's a fraternal space where two cultures meet and can exchange. End quote. He may have been talking about the physical border between two political entities, like the United States and Mexico, but his offerings of how we can see such a place ring true for the borders we stand upon tonight as well. Shall we regard the borders before us, the markers of newness and difference, as hideous, festering scars from which we draw back in horror? Or shall they be shared spaces of exchange and growth and opportunity and revelation? This is the question before us on this Yom Kippur. As we stand al gvul ha'or, on the border of light, b'shat t'murah, in this hour of change. Teshuvah, our turning toward repentance and renewal, demands of us that we approach borders with open hearts and minds, and that we believe that we can be new versions of ourselves, that we can know and learn from new people in our lives, that we can persevere in new situations that we experience. If we don't believe those things, there can be no true teshuvah. There can be no repentance. There can be no renewal. This coming Shabbat, in just 2 days, we will read the Torah as we always do, and we will read of Moses and his final speech, a song, a poem, to the Israelites as they stand on another border. This time, not the sea, but between the wilderness and the promised land. Moses is making his final oration because he will not cross over. God says to Moses in this week's parashah, Ki mineged tir'eh et ha'aretz, v'shama lo tavo, el ha'aretz asher ani noten livnei Yisrael. God says, you may view the land from a distance, Moses, but you shall not cross over that land that I am giving to the people. And we learn from this, we are reminded that it is indeed a privilege, a gift, to stand at the border and be invited to cross over into the light of a new year. So many in our community and beyond are not standing here with us at this border. They had a different kind of crossing over in the last year, one not of their choosing. So may we treasure this moment for the blessing that it is, a chance to embody hope and faith, a chance to choose life and embrace it, a chance not to draw back, but in this hour of change, a chance to cross over. Shana Tova.